The town of Valentine hadn't seen rain in 3 weeks, and the sky hung pale and motionless above the dirt, like it was holding its breath. Dust swirled low along the street, curling around boots and wagon wheels, as if even the earth didn't want to look at what was happening. Outside the Last Day saloon, a makeshift platform had been raised from crates and old planks, hammered together just sturdy enough to hold shame. The crowd had gathered before noon, some out of boredom, others out of meanness, and a few with silver in their pockets and hollowness in their eyes. They watched a thin man in a whiskey-stained coat shuffle a worn deck of cards, as though life were just another game. Harlan Creed was his name, and he was not the sort of man who waited for misfortune to find him. He dragged it behind him like a rickety cart, filled with debts and daughters. He stood with a gambler's smirk, his mustache twitching as he called out bids not yet made. 3 strong girls, he barked. 1 for cookin'. 1 for mendin'. 1 for singin' you to sleep if your soul's tired enough. The girls stood to his right, each a statue carved from a different kind of sorrow. The oldest, Molly, had her arms folded, chin lifted, eyes sharp and unblinking. She wore her pain like armor. Beside her, June looked half-wild, her fingers clenched into fists, jaw twitching with unspent fire. Mabel, the youngest, stood a step behind them, eyes glazed, humming something no one else could hear, her small body swaying gently. From across the square, a man watched them from the shade of a wagon. He was 40 by calendar and 60 by gaze. His name was Thomas Granger, and most folks knew him only in passing. The man with the Pinewood Ranch past Red Hollow, the one who rarely came to town unless the well went dry or the fence split during storm season. His beard was streaked with early gray, his shoulders broad but tired. 3 grown sons sat behind him on the wagon bench, shifting uncomfortably, casting glances toward their father and the crowd. Thomas hadn't come for the auction. He came for salt, nails, and 2 pounds of coffee. But fate doesn't knock politely. It strikes like a blade and leaves you wondering why your hands are covered in blood. He watched as Molly's gaze swept the crowd, meeting eyes, daring someone to try. She had no ring on her hand, no child at her hip, no protector. Just spine. And grief worn like a second skin. June's lip curled at a man in a brown vest who laughed too loud. Mabel blinked at the sun, lips still moving with whatever song she carried alone. Thomas shifted his weight. The youngest girl looked like his late wife's sister had at 13, thin-boned and dainty, but not delicate. Just tired. Worn too young by something no child should have faced. Harlan's voice rang out again. Let's not pretend they'll be virgins for long. Might as well get 'em before the saloon keepers do. I'll start the bidding at $15 apiece, or 40 for the lot. There was a silence then, not the kind that falls naturally, but the kind pulled out of a room like breath sucked from lungs. No one spoke. Even the wind paused. Thomas stepped down from the wagon. His boots stirred dust as he walked, slow and deliberate, past town men who suddenly found their shoes or sky worth examining. He didn't speak until he reached the platform. "Untie them," he said simply. Harlan blinked. "What?" Thomas's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "Untie your daughters and get off that platform before I knock you into next week." Harlan scoffed. "Who the hell do you think you are? A man who's had enough of cowards sellin' what they broke and claimin' it's still whole." He turned to the crowd. "You all came to watch. I hope you choke on what you saw. This ain't a stage and they ain't cattle." Harlan's hand twitched toward his coat. But Thomas's stare landed like a rifle barrel. The gambler faltered, then spat at the planks and stepped back, grumbling curses into his collar. The girls didn't move. Thomas looked to Molly. "You're free to go. But if you got nowhere to be. I've a house with rooms that don't leak. I've got sons who can keep to themselves and soup that doesn't run thin. You won't owe me anything." Molly's eyes narrowed. "Why?" "Because someone should have stopped him a long time ago. And because I got nothing to gain by standing here." He turned then, walking back toward the wagon as the crowd parted around him like sheep who suddenly remembered the wolf in their midst. For a moment, nothing moved. Then Molly stepped down. Her sisters followed, Mabel still humming. They climbed into the back of the wagon, settling between bags of feed and coils of rope. None of them spoke. Thomas didn't look back. The road out of town was narrow and lined with brittle cottonwoods. The wagon creaked. Caleb, the youngest son, kept glancing over his shoulder, trying not to stare. Mark offered Mabel a wrapped candy from his pocket. She took it with a small nod, unwrapped it like it might disappear. At the ranch, the porch sagged slightly from age, but it was clean. A yellow dog barked once and wagged his tail. The sun was starting to dip, and shadows leaned long across the yard. Thomas showed them the house. One room for each girl. Beds made, windows shuttered, nothing fancy. June muttered, "Is this a prison or a favor?" Thomas replied, "Whatever you need it to be." He left them there, unsupervised. That night, he slept in the barn. The next morning came soft, with pale light filtering through the kitchen window. Molly stood by the stove, staring at the unlit firebox. June was already outside, kicking at stones. Mabel sat in a corner with a dull spoon and a tin plate, tapping it softly like a drum. Thomas stood in the doorway, a mug of coffee in hand. His eldest son, Levi, leaned beside him. "What are we supposed to do?" Levi asked, not with resentment, just quiet confusion. "Let them breathe," Thomas said. They did. Days passed like drifting leaves. The girls didn't speak much. They ate, helped where asked, but kept to themselves. Thomas never pressed. Then one evening, Molly sat on the porch after supper, arms wrapped around her knees. The sun sank behind the hills, painting the fields gold and blood. Thomas sat beside her, silent. She spoke first. "You got no idea what he did to us." "No," he said. "And I don't need to. You're here now." Molly looked at him, something fierce and flickering in her eyes. "You can't save people like us." "I ain't trying to save you," he said. "Just giving you somewhere to stop running." She looked down. Her fingers curled around the porch rail. "You think we're fit to be around your sons?" "I think you're fit to be anywhere you damn well choose." There was a long pause. Then she nodded once. "Then we'll stay," she said. "For now." Thomas rose, his knees creaking. "That's enough." Behind them, fireflies blinked into the dusk, lighting the yard with tiny, careless sparks. Inside, Mabel's voice could be heard humming again, softer this time. And June, somewhere out near the barn, let loose a laugh no one expected. Thomas looked toward the horizon, where night was swallowing the light. 3 sisters had come to him like strays at the door, and he'd opened it without knowing why. But some things don't need reasons. Only a little room. And a man willing to remember that mercy, like rain, comes slow, but softens even the hardest land. The morning after the girls arrived, the Granger house felt different. Not louder. Not fuller. Just different, like a wind had shifted direction, and no one quite knew whether it was blowing in storm or spring. Thomas rose before dawn, same as always. He moved through the kitchen with his usual silence, setting a kettle on the stove and grinding beans slow, as if noise might wake something still fragile. He didn't see Molly already sitting at the table until he turned. She didn't speak. Just nodded once. Her eyes were sharp but tired, and she held a chipped mug in both hands like it anchored her. She hadn't poured coffee yet. She was waiting. For warmth. Or welcome. He nodded back and poured 2 mugs. They drank in silence. A kind of treaty. Outside, the frost still clung to the fence posts. The barn roof glinted like bone under the thin morning light. Thomas's sons were already up. Levi splitting logs near the shed, Caleb brushing down the mare, Mark trying and failing to fix the crooked chicken coop door again. Inside the house, the girls stirred slowly. June padded barefoot across the wooden floor, her shoulders wrapped in a quilt. She narrowed her eyes at Thomas, then walked past him without a word, settling beside Molly. Mabel came last, dressed in the same clothes from the day before, her hair a tangle of sleep. She didn't speak, just leaned her head against June's arm. June blinked, but didn't pull away. Thomas cleared his throat gently. "You'll have your own rooms," he said, voice low worn. "No locks. No one will enter without knocking. If there's anything you need, you can ask." Molly looked at him. And what do you expect from us? He shook his head. Nothing you don't want to give. Then why? I told you already. House was empty. You needed one. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. Just long. The kind that needs space to be understood. Later that day, the girls walked the house. Molly found her room by the east window. June took the smallest room, maybe out of stubbornness. Mabel chose the one with a faded drawing pinned to the wall, done in child's charcoal. A tree with stars in the branches. The house had only one bathroom, and the plumbing worked when it felt inclined. Still, it was warm, clean, and quiet. The girls didn't seem to know what to do with that. The boys kept to themselves. Levi watched from a distance, always working, rarely talking. He moved like a man born with a burden tied to his spine. Mark tried to be friendly, but was too nervous to be casual. His laughter came too fast, too bright, like a candle flickering in wind. Caleb, the youngest, barely looked up when spoken to. He wasn't shy, just unsure. He stole glances at Molly but looked away quick, like it stung to hold her gaze. Molly watched them all. She didn't trust Easy. She moved through the house like someone who expected doors to lock behind her. She kept a knife under her pillow, not hidden, just known. A demolition. That second night, she sat by the fireplace and asked Thomas, "Were you ever cruel?" He didn't flinch. "No." "Then were you ever weak?" His eyes stayed on the flames. "Yes." Molly nodded, as if that made him real. Meals were quiet affairs. The girls cooked when they felt like it. The boys washed dishes without being asked. The balance was unsure, a dance no one knew the steps to. But no one raised their voice. No one raised their hand. June clashed with Levi the first time they spoke. She had left her muddy boots in the hallway. He asked her, plain as rain, to move them. "You run this place like a church?" She snapped. "No," he said. "But I built that floor and I'd like it to last." Her jaw tensed, but she moved the boots. Later, she brought in extra kindling without a word. Mark caught Mabel humming again as she walked the fence line. He didn't interrupt, just followed at a distance, fixing a broken gate latch behind her. She glanced at him once, blinked, then kept humming. The house began to breathe again. Thomas spent most evenings outside. Not far. Just on the porch, carving little birds from cedar scraps. He used to make them for his wife, before she passed. He didn't tell the girls that. He didn't need to. On the fourth day, Molly stepped into the barn. She watched Caleb work the hay bales, arms tense, movements sharp. He saw her and dropped the pitchfork. "Sorry," he muttered, backing up. "I'm not a rattlesnake," she said. "I know," he said quickly, then added, "You move quiet is all." She looked at him for a long beat. "You're afraid of me?" "No," he said, honest and unflinching. "I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing." She tilted her head. "Then don't say anything." He nodded, and they stood in silence. She didn't mind it. That evening, Mark tried to make a joke at dinner. Something about the mule being smarter than all three brothers combined. June nearly smiled. Mabel laughed out loud for the first time. It echoed across the table, high and clear. Even Thomas chuckled, soft and brief. Later that night, Molly passed Thomas on the porch. "You didn't ask what happened to our mother," she said. "I figured if you wanted me to know you'd say." She nodded. "He sold her first. To a man in Kansas. We never saw her again." "I'm sorry." "We stopped being sorry a long time ago." He offered her the bird he'd carved that night. A dove. Simple, unfinished. She took it without a word. Mabel found an old sewing kit in the hall drawer, and started stitching scraps of cloth into something small and shapeless. June began wearing her hair in braids again. Molly started waking earlier. Not because she had to, but because the quiet before dawn felt like her own. One afternoon, June followed Levi to the well. "You always so serious?" she asked. "Mostly." "Why?" "Someone's got to be." She smiled faintly. "Maybe not anymore." He blinked. "Maybe not." The sky that night turned violet before the stars came out. Mabel sat under the window with her thread and cloth, humming the same tune. Mark carved a little flute from a cane reed and offered it to her. She took it, played one note, and nodded. Thomas sat alone again, watching shadows shift on the porch. Molly joined him, arms crossed, eyes half-lidded. "You think this'll work?" she asked. "I don't know what this is yet." She didn't smile. But she didn't walk away. That night, before the lamps were turned out, the girls gathered in Mabel's room. Not to talk. Just to sit, back to back, shoulder to shoulder. 3 sisters in 3 empty rooms. Now, not quite so empty. A silence fell over the house. Not fearful, but full of breath. A stillness that held possibility. And in that quiet, something began to take root. Something patient. Something real. Spring came not with a trumpet but a whisper. The snowmelt sliding lazy down the hills, the creek swelling just enough to sing again. The fence lines held steady this year, and the wind blew soft through the bare cottonwoods, whispering to buds too shy to bloom just yet. Inside the Granger house, change came just as slow. Nothing grand. Nothing spoken. Just the quiet rearrangement of lives stitched side by side. Molly began her mornings with the broom, sweeping the hallway from back to front without being asked. It was not obedience. It was control, over something, anything. June took to the porch steps at dusk, sharpening knives with slow, deliberate strokes, more out of ritual than fear. And Mabel had turned the storage closet into a place all her own, stringing threads across the wall, weaving bits of fabric into something unnamed. Thomas watched without comment. He understood the power of stillness. He knew healing didn't gallop. It walked barefoot, careful not to startle the pain beneath. The boys had settled, too. Levi repaired the barn roof with Molly nearby, neither speaking, both working. Mark managed to coax a laugh from June every third attempt. Caleb sometimes lingered by Mabel's doorway, not speaking, just listening to her hum. It was the middle of April when the well went dry. Thomas stood over it one morning, bucket drawn up with nothing but grit and regret. He scratched his beard, sighed low, and looked toward the river, half a mile down the slope. By midday, a chain of buckets had formed, sons and daughters alike, walking the path down and back with the rhythm of necessity. No one complained. No one paused. Even Mabel joined, carrying a tin pail nearly half her size, determined. That evening, as they sat on the porch, Molly looked at Thomas and said, "We should dig another well." He raised a brow. "That so?" She nodded. "I'll help." So did Levi. The next morning, the digging began, slow, sweaty, stubborn work. The kind that grinds conversation into silence, where the only sound is shovel biting earth and breath pulled from lungs. Molly didn't hesitate. She worked beside Levi, sleeves rolled, hair tied, blistering her hands without flinching. At noon, Thomas brought bread and apples. They sat in the dirt, sun baking their backs. "You ever build anything?" Levi asked her. Molly looked at him. "Once. A shed. It collapsed." He grinned. "Then you've got a good start." That night, she soaked her hands in salt water, wincing only once. Caleb left a jar of ointment outside her door. No note. She used it. The next day, June asked Mark to teach her how to saddle a horse properly. He blinked at her like he hadn't heard. "Well?" she said, hand on her hip. He scrambled to say yes. They spent the afternoon in the corral. June cursed the cinch strap, cursed the heat, cursed the dust, then finally laughed. Not loud. Not careless. But a real, unguarded sound that startled even the mare. Mark didn't say much. He just smiled. She saw it, and her laughter stopped, softening into something unreadable. "Don't get ideas," she muttered. "No, ma'am." "Stop calling me ma'am." "Yes. June." She didn't correct him. Inside the house, Mabel had started cooking. At first, it was burnt potatoes and dry cornbread. Then came soft eggs, tart apple tarts, warm biscuits that tasted like memory. She baked without fuss, humming old melodies as she mixed and kneaded. Caleb hovered more each day, offering to fetch flour, split wood, carry buckets. "You don't have to help," she said once. I want to, he replied, not meeting her eyes. She handed him a spoon and pointed to the bowl. Then stir. Clockwise. No cheating. Evenings became quieter in a different way. Not hollow. Not cautious. Just peaceful. Levi played the fiddle on the porch. Mark told stories that had no real endings. June listened, leaning against the post, arms crossed but relaxed. Molly sometimes joined, sitting beside Thomas, not touching, not talking. Just being. One night, she finally asked, "Why haven't you asked us to leave?" Thomas shrugged. "You haven't tried to leave. Would you stop us?" "No." "Then why do you care?" He took his time answering. "Because life's been cruel to the good too many times. I figure it's time someone held the door open instead of shutting it." She nodded slow. "Not many men think that way." "No. But more should." In the barn, Caleb showed Mabel how to twist rope. She twisted hers backward. He corrected her with a nervous smile. She laughed and did it wrong again on purpose. "You always this patient?" she asked. He thought about it. "Only with things that matter." She stared at him a moment too long. Then passed him the coil. The new well came together in 6 days. Not deep, not perfect, but enough. Molly and Levi had carved each layer like it was a promise. When water finally filled the bottom, dark and steady, Molly leaned on her shovel and grinned. "You didn't think I'd stick it out," she said. Levi wiped his brow. "Didn't think anything. Just hoped." "Hope's dangerous." He met her eyes. "So's giving up." That night, they all sat together for supper. No lines drawn. No eyes downcast. The stew was warm, the biscuits golden. June passed the salt to Mark without a word. Mabel laid her fork down gently, hands folded, content. Thomas raised his glass. "To water." They laughed. Even Molly smiled, lips pressed but real. Later, as dusk blanketed the sky and the porch lights glowed dim, Molly walked beside the garden. Rose still bare but waiting. Levi joined her. He didn't speak. She didn't either. But she handed him the trowel and gestured to the soil. "Plant something," she said. "If it lives, it lives. If not, we try again." And he did. In the stillness of that night, the house no longer felt like it was holding its breath. It exhaled. Slow. Steady. And somewhere deep in the quiet soil, things began to grow. The days had fallen into rhythm. Morning chores, warm suppers, quiet smiles traded across porch rails. Laughter no longer startled anyone. The girls no longer flinched when boots hit floorboards. Spring had tucked its fingers into the seams of the Granger house, patching old wounds with sunlight and steady hands. Then came the writer. He arrived on a Tuesday, just before sundown. The horizon still wore the day's gold, but the wind shifted, sharp with a scent no one liked: sweat, tobacco, and gun oil. His horse kicked dust as it halted at the fence line, nostrils flaring. The man didn't dismount. Thomas stepped out first, wiping his hands on a rag. He didn't reach for a weapon. Just watched. His son stood behind him, silent. The girls appeared slowly in the doorway, Molly's hand instinctively reaching back to steady Mabel. The rider leaned forward. "Looking for what's mine," he said. No one answered. Harlan Creed pulled off his hat and spat into the dirt. His hair was longer than before, more silver than blonde, and his eyes twitched with sunburnt anger. The revolver at his hip gleamed clean, oiled, ready. "You think I forgot?" he called, louder now. "You think you could just walk off with them like they were yours to keep?" Thomas stepped off the porch, slow and measured. "They walked away from you. They're still mine by law." "No. They're not." Harlan smirked. "This ain't a courtroom, friend." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's right. It's a home. You ain't welcome here." Mark moved closer to June. Caleb stepped in front of Mabel. Levi didn't move at all, but his stance was a storm waiting to break. Molly stepped forward. Her voice cut clean through the air. "We're not yours. We're not for sale. We're not going anywhere." Harlan looked at her, then at the house, the barn, the fields behind them. You think this little setup changes anything? You think a few home-cooked meals and soft words make you something better than what you were? No, Molly said. But it makes us free. Free? He laughed, short and bitter. You're a bunch of whores living off charity. Levi stepped forward, face hard. Say that again. Why? You planning to fight me over someone else's mistake? Thomas raised a hand, stopping Levi's next step. His voice stayed low. I'm only going to ask once more. Leave. Harlan dismounted, slowly. The revolver stayed in its holster, but his hand hovered. You think I'm alone? From the trail came two more riders. Younger men, rough-looking, scarred. Harlan jerked a thumb toward them. They're here to see justice done. Caleb swallowed hard. Mark clenched his jaw. The girls didn't move. Molly's gaze never left Harlan's. June's fingers flexed at her sides. Mabel stepped back behind the doorframe. The standoff stretched long and quiet. Then, from the distance, hooves sounded. Another rider, coming fast from the opposite ridge. Dust curled up behind him. It was the sheriff. He pulled up hard beside Harlan, looking over the scene with wary eyes. Something I should know about? He asked, scanning the tense silence. Harlan gestured wide. This man stole my daughters. Took him like property. The sheriff looked at Thomas, then at Molly. That true? No, Molly said. We left. He was selling us on a crate outside the saloon. This man offered us safety, nothing else. I got witnesses, Harlan said. I got bruises, June snapped. Wanna count those too? The sheriff dismounted, slower now. He looked older than his badge, weary of this kind of trouble. He scratched his beard, then glanced toward Thomas. You take him in? I opened my door, Thomas said. They walked in on their own. You planning to marry them off? Harlan asked, venom behind the grin. Turn them into Granger property? No one belongs to anyone here, Thomas said. The sheriff turned back to the girls. You want to stay? Yes, Molly said. The sheriff nodded, slow. Then I ain't got cause to move him. Harlan stepped forward, furious. You're siding with them? With him. I'm siding with what the law says, the sheriff muttered. And the law don't recognize daughters as debt collateral. But there. The sheriff cut him off with a look. You say one more word, Harlan, and I'll have you locked for public threat and trespass. Harlan's lip curled. He turned to his men, snarled something under his breath. The three of them stood a moment longer, trying to hold the ground with pride alone. Then Harlan spat in the dirt again, turned to his horse and mounted. This ain't the end of it, he said, voice low. Thomas didn't blink. It is here. They rode off, hooves thudding like closing doors. The sheriff lingered a moment, then tipped his hat. You've got a hard piece here, Thomas. Don't lose it. We won't, Thomas said. The sheriff rode off. Silence returned, thick and shivering. Levi exhaled. Mark looked like he might shake apart. Caleb stepped back inside, wordless. Molly turned to Thomas. You didn't have to do that. He met her eyes. Yes, I did. She looked like she might say more, but the words never formed. Later, when the lanterns were lit and the dinner table full again, no one spoke about the man with the gun, or the law that hadn't come soon enough. They talked about the well and the planting, and the mare set to foal next week. Molly sat across from Caleb. June passed Mark the cornbread. Levi refilled Mabel's cup without needing to ask. After supper, Thomas sat on the porch, knife in hand, whittling again. Molly joined him. For the first time, she didn't keep her arms folded. I thought I was done believing in men like you, she said. You don't have to believe in me, he replied. Just believe the door's still open. A breeze stirred. Somewhere down in the fields, the night birds began to sing. And above them all the stars came out, quiet witnesses to a war not fought with bullets, but with something harder, mercy. The days that followed settled over the Granger ranch like a soft quilt, worn but warm. Nothing grand happened. Nothing needed to. The threat was gone, the past still present but quiet now, like a storm seen far off on the plains, still remembered but no longer overhead. Spring had ripened. The air carried the weight of pollen and soil, the scent of things alive and still becoming. The girls had slipped into their roles not by demand but by rhythm. The boys no longer hovered with caution, but walked beside them, shoulder to shoulder. Not as saviors. Not as owners. Just as men who'd finally learned to see beyond what was easy to hold. Thomas spent more time on the porch these days. Not because he was tired, though he was, but because there was something worth watching again. Something blooming, even in old soil. The porch had become a stage for the slow and necessary unfolding of trust. Molly had taken to the garden. She wore no bonnet, let the sun kiss her skin, and didn't flinch when it burned. She planted without speaking, dug with purpose, and watered with the tenderness of someone who'd once been left dry too long. Caleb came to her most often now, quiet as ever, but his hands offered more than help. He brought her seeds wrapped in linen, old books on weather and soil, and once, a worn ribbon-dyed plum, which she accepted with a nod that meant everything. Levi mended the chicken coop for the third time that week. June said he was obsessive. He replied the hinges were stubborn. She rolled her eyes but stayed close, always within 5 paces, always with one foot pointed toward him. One evening she caught him watching her when she brushed Mabel's hair and kissed her brow. "You look at me like I'm soft," she said. "I look at you like you survived." Same thing. He didn't argue. Mabel was a different song altogether. She sang now. Not for others, just to the wind, to the well, to the bread she needed before dawn. She rode bareback in the field behind the barn, her braids flying, the old mare understanding something gentle passed between them. Mark crafted her a small harp from willow and thread. She played it wrong for days, but always with joy. They didn't call what they had a family. Not yet. The word still carried too much weight. But something deeper had rooted, and roots, after all, don't ask permission to grow, they just do. It was Molly who first brought up the idea. She did it the way she did everything, with care and a touch of fire. She stood on the porch after supper, arms crossed, the sky behind her soaked in lavender. Thomas was lighting his pipe, Levi oiling the hinges on the screen door. The girls were inside, laughing over something Mabel had said. "We've been here months," Molly said. Thomas looked up. And we're not guests anymore. We're not looking to leave. That's the truth. I know. She took a breath. We'd like to speak to you. All of you. She nodded. All of us. He rose slowly, stepped inside. The boys followed. The 6 of them sat at the table again. No food now, just hands folded, eyes steady. It was June who went first. She never flinched from fire. "I want to marry Levi," she said. "Not because he saved me. Not because I owe him anything. But because he treats me like I ain't broken." Levi swallowed hard. His hand twitched on the table. Thomas nodded once. No ceremony in the gesture, just quiet acknowledgement. Mark cleared his throat. "I'd like to ask Mabel." "She's young," Thomas said. "I'll wait if I have to." Mabel smiled and squeezed his hand. "I don't want him to wait." Thomas looked at her. "You sure?" "Yes," she said. "He makes the world quiet." Then came Molly. She didn't sit straight. Didn't smile. She just reached for Caleb's hand and held it. "I spent years thinking love had to be earned through pain. But Caleb, he never asked me to be anything. Just let me be." Caleb blushed, then whispered, "She's already everything." Thomas sat back. He looked at his sons, at the girls who had once stood on a crate like ghosts of their own bodies. He thought of his late wife, her voice in the breeze, her silence in the garden. "You don't need my permission," he said. "But you have my blessing." They married beneath the cottonwoods. The whole town came, most not out of kindness but curiosity. The same folks who'd watched the auction months ago now stood in clean shirts, holding pies and shaking hands. The ceremony wasn't fancy. There were no lace veils or silver rings. The dresses were stitched by Molly and Mabel, simple and soft. June wore her boots. Mabel wore wildflowers in her braid. The boys wore the same coats they'd been baptized in, brushed clean. Thomas stood before them, not as a preacher, but as witness. His voice was rough, but steady. You've seen each other at your worst. That matters more than any promise made in candlelight. If you can love after the dust settles, you can love through anything. The vows were plain. June promised to never mistake silence for weakness. Levi promised to speak only when his words were worthy. Mabel promised laughter, even on hard days. Mark promised presence, even when the wind pulled at his old restlessness. Molly promised nothing but truth. Caleb promised never to hide from hers. They kissed not as strangers meeting in new skin, but as those who had already built a life. This was just the door marked with their names. That night, the ranch glowed. Lanterns hung from trees. Fiddle music swayed the breeze. Mabel danced with bare feet, her harp tucked under her arm. June challenged Levi to a footrace. Molly stood under the stars, Caleb beside her, his hand resting lightly against her back. Not to claim. Just to say I'm here. Thomas sat on the porch, his pipe in one hand, a mug in the other. He watched them all, his sons, his new daughters, the land he'd once believed would outlive joy. Mark sat beside him after a while. You did good, Mark said. I just opened the door. Sometimes that's enough. They sat in silence. Crickets hummed, soft and steady. Inside, laughter spilled from the windows like warm smoke. Thomas exhaled. Years of grief had etched his face deep, but tonight it felt lighter. The lines had softened. The air smelled of fresh bread and new beginnings. Molly stepped outside, alone, holding something wrapped in cloth. She approached Thomas and placed it in his lap. He unwrapped it slow. It was the cedar dove he'd carved, now painted white, its wings etched with flowers. We wanted you to have it, she said. He looked at her, eyes unreadable. You kept us alive, she added. But more than that, you gave us a place to be. He ran his thumb along the wings. You gave me something too, he said. She waited. A reason to finish what I started. She sat beside him then, both watching the lanterns flicker in the trees, like stars caught in branches. The porch creaked as others joined. Mabel leaned against the railing, plucking her harp. June brought leftover pie. Caleb fell asleep on the top step. Levi dozed beside him. Mark hummed an old song under his breath. No one said the word home. They didn't need to. It was there in every breath, every touch, every vow carved into air and held firm by kindness. The wind shifted again, gentler now, as if the land itself exhaled. In a world that had once sold them, doubted them, broken them, here they stood. Not bought, not beaten, but blooming. Together. And on that quiet porch, under a sky too wide for words, the past finally gave way to peace.